Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Well, folks, welcome to this bonus episode where we're going to answer some of our listener questions.
We have listener questions?
Yes, we have listener questions.
We have listeners?
Yes, we've got an amazing number of listeners. If you are a listener, please raise your hand by sharing our episodes, commenting when we post on social media. Just let people know that this is a fantastic podcast and you love listening to it, because we have heard from you that you really love this. So please share it out there. Rate us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Leave your comments. Just a little tip in there so that more people can enjoy what we have to offer here.
You know what I actually discovered, Natalie, listening to just a different podcast? Spotify now has a feature that you can comment within Spotify on the individual episode.
That is true. And as a matter of fact, one of the questions we're answering today came through that way.
Wow. This was not a setup. I did not know that.
I don't think I mentioned that. Or maybe was it? Yeah, no. I think it was one of the questions that came through was sent to us via Spotify. So we have kind of a little backlog of questions because it's been a minute. We kind of held on to a few because we had a bunch of them. One of the things that people have asked is, where can they listen to the Bible? As we've said before, we're not reading it to you, but folks are looking for a place that they can have someone else read it to them. So what are the resources that we know of out there?
So there's like two basic formats you can do. If you're the kind of person that likes physical media, you want a CD. There are CD sets of people that will read the Bible to you. Some of them have all kinds of like music in the background and they're really dramatic, and some of them aren't. We had, was it James Earl Jones?
Yeah. So we were having a little conversation back and forth, and we kind of joked about, wouldn't it be fantastic to have the Bible read to you by Morgan Freeman? And then Rick responded, or James Earl Jones. And it turns out that you can, in fact, purchase an audiobook of James Earl Jones reading the Bible to you. It is in the King James Version.
Cool.
But you can get that. In fact, you can also get Johnny Cash reading you the New Testament in the new King James Version.
Wow.
If you like those voices.
That's wild.
I did not, in my Google search to answer this question, I didn't find very many female voices available. I think I did find one, but just in case you were curious about that.
The other option beyond the CD is an app. And there are several apps that will read you the Bible. The Bible app. It's just the Bible app. It's the most used Bible app out there.
Yeah, produced by YouVersion, if you're looking to make sure you have the right one.
And it has a gajillion versions. Like you can listen to the NIV or the NLT or a lot of different versions, and many of those versions will have audio versions along with it. You can be reading, and then you can just click the little audio icon and you can just listen to it read to you, and then it will pick up and you can read it again if you want.
Yeah. Maybe an additional just practical tip on your comment about the CD is, I don't know if people use Amazon, but if you just go on Amazon and type in CD Bible, you can find a multitude. I don't have any experience with these. I imagine you two probably do not have any experience with these CDs. So I couldn't recommend like which is best, but I would maybe stick with an NIV one. I saw a few pop up immediately. That's probably a good bet if you're looking for a physical media. Digital media, I do like the YouVersion one. The reading can sound a little robotic. Someone asked me this question and I was testing them out. Also, the interface of that app can just be a little clunky. Like there's just a lot going on in the app. It's not super smooth. One app that is designed really well that I recommended to someone recently is the ESV Bible app. not my favorite translation. It's pretty middle of the road, pretty readable. It's very similar to NIV. There's a few things I don't like about it. That's another conversation, but they have a very clean user interface, and the voice for it, there's one free voice, easy to use, really simple, and it sounds pretty good. It's a real person, and you can purchase further voices. So, depending on if you want to like get into this really. But I know a lot of people have asked us this because they want to listen on their commute to work or as they're in bed at night. So I get it. I think none of us really anticipated how many people wanted audio versions.
Yeah. And there aren't prolific, there are options out there, but one of the things to keep in mind is that translations of the Bible are copyrighted. So you can't just produce one without some paying for the copyright for that sort of thing. I think YouVersion finds some way to
get around that.
Get around that or work with people in order to produce it. If you read on their website, they kind of explain that a little bit. How to get that into their app.
I would almost guess, this is a whole nother conversation. I would almost guess a big part of this now is AI, kind of avoiding copyright issues because AI is just generating it for some of these platforms. I don't know. Now you would know more about that, Natalie.
I can't speak to whether that's the case already. If there's AI involved, but that would be worth looking into. AI voices are not as soothing to listen to as our dulcet tones, that of an actual human being. But that could be very.
Some of the premium versions actually are. They're getting pretty good. I've used some apps that read PDFs for you. And again, usually you have to like buy the nicer voices, but they'll give you a sample. And I tried one once at the recommendation of my friend. And so who knows? We're way in the rabbit hole. I wouldn't even know how to recommend this to someone. But I think you could get one that would read the Bible app for you if you uploaded it. I don't know, but it was pretty impressive. I was like, this really sounds like a human, which kind of scared me a little bit. Anyway.
Yes, AI. We're going to leave that for a whole other episode of the podcast.
We'll have to, I know the men just had a speaker talk about AI.
Fascinating.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to bring him onto the podcast. Would be completely unrelated.
All right. So hopefully we have sufficiently answered your questions. Our next question we got via our phone voice message, and this message is from Bruce. Let's listen in.
My question relates to the Bible reading plan, which is as the books appear in the Bible, and compared to a chronological reading plan. Curious the pros and cons of the two. Thanks much.
Thank you, Bruce, for your question. It's really good. Part of the reason that we're doing this one is because as Natalie said, this is my plan.
This is Rick's plan.
And this is how I've been doing it for years. And so there are ways you can purchase a chronological Bible, which means that your books are not in the normal order that they are. And in fact, chapters are you kind of flip back and forth between books. You can also do a chronological plan, but that requires you to then flip back and forth. And so part of the idea of this plan is just to be like super simple, and we're just reading cover to cover. So you don't have to do a lot of jumping around, but you just turn to the next page. Early on through the early parts of the Torah, we're not getting a lot of like jumping around through different timelines. It's kind of consistent. We will find later in what are called the historical books, where we're going to hear 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and we're going to hear like one long history. And then we're going to go to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and we're going to get the same exact history, just told from a slightly different viewpoint, as we already heard in Samuel and Kings. And so there might be a place where you might have wanted a chronological reading, but you get it twice.
But as is the case, sometimes you get the stories twice right within the same set of scriptures. So, we're getting used to hearing this stuff repeated.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. So our next question comes from Reed. Let's have a listen.
My question is, how are we supposed to interpret some of the things in Genesis which are a little bit hard to believe, such as people living, into their hundreds, having children at, well into their hundreds. Even the story about Noah and the animals and the ark coming to rest on top of a mountain. Later, the parting of the Red Sea. Things that if you've never been indoctrinated or read this information before, if you're reading it for the first time, you might just, in today's sensibilities, you might just want to put the book down and say, this is a fable. This doesn't make any sense. How can I be asked to believe this? So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Great question, Reed. Thanks for sending that one in. I think one thing Rick said, which was a really great point in a previous episode, is that the best question you can ask is, why are these things written down? What has made these stories endure? And the ages of some of the patriarchs in Genesis is, I think, a great test case for this. These aren't written down so that we can read them and go, oh my gosh, let's just make up a name. Lamech was 562 years old when he died. That has no impact on my life. I don't really need to know this information as just historical information, right? But something Rick talked about in a previous episode is that these ages are being communicated for a theological reason, namely that with the fall in Genesis 3, we are moving out further from the presence of God and therefore moving further away from the abundant life of walking with God, of knowing God's presence. And so what we see with these ages is a slow decrease. Now, that might be unsatisfying. You still might just be left with the question, well, is this really what happened? And personally, I'm happy to let Rick and Natalee take a stab at it. I'm kind of just okay with the grayness of that question, with saying, personally, I find I lean more into this being poetic than maybe more literal. I have many friends that lean into this being very literal. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really up to the listener to decide on the believability of some of these things. I think I could say more, but.
So we were talking earlier, and if you go into a library, there's a fiction section and a nonfiction section. And if you went to a nonfiction section and you picked up a book, you are really going to be expecting everything in that book to be factually accurate, mm-hmm. right? Or as much as the author can do. If you started finding things that were intentionally wrong in the nonfiction section, you would be annoyed by that.
Right.
The New York Times does the same thing, bestseller list, right? Like there's fiction and there's nonfiction. Our ancient forebears did not have that same categorical system.
Right.
And sometimes they are writing because they're saying this is what happened. And it's mm-hmm. important that we tell the story of our people. Almost all the time, they are writing because they want to convey meaning. And the meaning is beyond the details of the historicity of right. something. The question of, did Moses, God, actually split the Red Sea, which is one of the things that Reed brought up in his question. Mm-hmm. I mean, we can argue that. There are people who want to go like dig around the Dead Sea and find chariot wheels and say,
right.
here's where it happened. And then archaeologists have to come by and debunk that. But theologically, what we see is that, number one, God is saving his people in dramatic fashion. In the ancient world, the scariest thing that they could imagine was water. It's true today. I mean, you have a major hurricane. You have the floods mm-hmm. that happened in the American South this past fall. Mm-hmm. Entire towns wiped off the map. Mm-hmm. Water, when it comes out of its bounds, is really scary. And our ancient forebears knew this. And so one of the ways they said over and over again that our God is large and in charge is that he has control over water. And so in the story of creation, God splits the waters above and the waters below. And God creates dry land and says the sea's going to be here, but it's not going to be over there. Here in the story of the Exodus, God exercises power over water by moving it. In the New Testament, Jesus is going to walk on water, and he's going to
calm
the seas. And so it's a way of saying that God is able to calm and still the chaos in our world and in our hearts. And I think that conversation is a lot more interesting and fun than did this actually happen historically on a specific day in a specific place.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's great.
And just to reiterate that the intention of the writing of these books was not to, in the same way that we think of them now, to be a fully historical document. This is a document for the purpose of faith, for the purpose of sharing.
Our ancient forebears had no idea what a dispassionate history would be.
Yeah.
We are used to like picking up a history book on the Civil War or World War II or whatever, and like this is what happened. Our ancient forebears did not do that.
Even then, as the quote goes, history is written by the victors. Even when we do look back at our history, there are multiple perspectives to look at. And we also often will look back at our history with our own modern interpretation of things. I was just reading within the last couple of months something about they've done new studies in Pompeii, and it's overturned some of their assumptions about the family units that were buried in that volcano. They've discovered through DNA evidence that people were not family units in the way that we would have imagined them. They think, oh, this was a mother and a child and whatever, but the DNA shows actually, no, they were not related.
Right.
So, all that to just caution against looking at this as though it's a hard fact that isn't somehow.
I love that caution. I would also caution against like an over reduction. I believe in miracles. You know what I mean? And like if we're going to believe that there is a God who created the universe and the laws that govern that universe, then we have to probably also believe that this God can
do miraculous things,
and put those laws aside. And there Thomas Jefferson famously published a version of the Gospels, the Jefferson Bible.
Yeah. And
he cut out all of the miracles of Jesus because he thought that, in the Enlightenment, this is ridiculous. We don't need to do this. All we need is the moral teachings of Jesus. And okay, it's interesting, but I don't need to have the miracles of Jesus or Moses cut out of my Bible.
Right.
I think God can do great things.
This might get far into the weeds, but I was reading something about the parting of the Red Sea, and I was reading a Jewish commentator talking about how even in the text of Exodus, there is almost a tension of understanding how this miraculous event happened. Are you familiar with the two? Not. So in the text of Exodus, there are kind of almost two competing ways that God talks about this parting of the Red Sea. The first, if you remember, is that he tells Moses to lift up his staff and that the Red Sea will basically be miraculously parted when he lifts up his staff, the same staff he uses for the plagues, right? The other one, this is in chapter 14, if Reed wants to go check it out, or anyone else. The second one is that Moses lifts up his staff, or stretches out his hand, over the sea. This is chapter 14, verse 21. It says, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. And what this Jewish commentator was saying is there's actually even almost a tension of like, Exodus trying to explain how this miracle happened. One, it's very like direct divine intervention. The other is
but it's also a wind.
But then it's also in this other part a wind. And that's not to, try to, I think a temptation we often have, and you see this and it's so annoying, is to like naturalize miracles of, oh, well, this plague was actually, this happened and it was this season and these cycles. But it is interesting the way even in this story, the author is trying to use God using these natural means to make this event happen. Anyway, I think that's just an interesting way of this Jewish author was saying there's even this tension in ancient texts and in their interpretation of trying to understand how do miracles actually take place. So,
and as we've discussed before, there's also the point of view that God is bigger and broader than our boxes for God. And there's so much more to understand, even with how far we've come with our scientific understandings. There are still things we don't have explanations for.
Right.
And there's still space for wonder and for things that seem miraculous.
And you know what? I think it's really important to say, and I am guilty of this sometimes, ancient people were not stupid. Yes. Even if they did not understand certain things we now understand as a result of science. I gave the example in one of our very first episodes about the beginning of Genesis. And you could sit there and be like, oh, this isn't believable, 7 days and blah, blah, blah. And how in the first day, light is created. And then in I think the third day, the sun and the stars and the moon are created. Ancient people didn't read that and think like, oh yeah, this makes sense. Like they knew this was poetic. They knew that that to Rick's point, there was a theological point being conveyed here. They didn't think light just somehow existed without actual stellar bodies, right? Like, so, I think we also need to remember that is that there are poetic and metaphorical things happening in a lot of these texts, and the people that wrote them and the people that read them were aware of that.
Yep.
Now, it gets really dicey. Did they really believe these people lived 1,000 years? I'm not sure. I'm not an ancient person. I don't have access to ancient people. But I like to think they are aware of some of these tropes and metaphors that are at play as well. So maybe the
question really is, I don't want to beat a dead horse here. Right. We are really answering Reed's question here.
I've had a lot of people ask me this individually. Is like, this stuff seems absurd. And did this stuff really happen? And
there is no one on planet Earth that believes that God is a rock. And yet in Psalm 18:2, it says, the Lord is my rock. But there's no one that's like, oh yeah, so God's a rock. Like God's a piece of marble, right? No one believes that.
No.
Because everyone reads that, the Lord is my rock. And we go, oh, that's a metaphor. Because there are aspects of being a rock that we can ascribe to God. God is steadfast. God's always there. God's not going to change, blah, blah, blah. We can rely on it like a rock. But there are other places where Jesus will be like, love your neighbor as yourself. None of us are going to sit here and be like, oh, that's just a metaphor. Like that's just some weird thing that Jesus said. It was, cultural and he didn't really mean it that way. No, we believe that Jesus means to love your neighbor as yourself. And so part of the tension of interpreting the Bible and reading the Bible is figuring out for ourselves, like, where is the line between like, this is rich with metaphor and this is what we're actually supposed to just do.
Right.
Right. And that it's not always clear. The Bible never says, okay, now we're switching into metaphor. And so you all just like sit down and relax for a minute. It just does.
Yeah.
And so it's work.
And that's why we read it and we reread it and we hear it read to us in church.
Yeah.
And we hear it read to us in church again.
Yep.
Because we just need to keep approaching it.
Yeah.
It's got more for us.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the wrestling. This is Jacob and the angel. This is Israel.
Full circle.
Full circle. Wrestling with God.
Well, wrestling with God sort of brings me to our next question. This one was written in by Josh, asking, when did God start speaking to the people of Israel? Now, there's a quick and easy answer of in the beginning. Right away, it indicates that God is speaking to Adam and Eve right there in the garden. But I feel like something else is really being asked in this question.
I mean, I think part of the one of the central claims of the Bible, it's hard to say things like the Bible says and just like extrapolate it out. But this is, I think, one of the things that like you see all over the place is this claim that God speaks to us, and God speaks to us differently. God speaks to Joseph through dreams, and God wrestles with Jacob, and like there's different ways that God comes to us, and that we hear from God. But the claim is that this God keeps coming to us, keeps seeking relationship, keeps communicating, and then listens back when we communicate.
Right.
And so if that's the central claim, then I think the answer has to be like always, like this is
right. And still does. Right?
And still
That's
does.
a great point Natalee made of like,
Yep.
Ask yourself the question, how does God speak to us today?
Yep.
Well, we come to church, we hear scripture read, we meet God in rituals. Our main ritual being
You might have a dream.
Yeah, you might have a dream, so.
In prayer, a lot of people find
Absolutely.
God in prayer, solo, communal prayer, or out in wilderness. People find God in nature
Through each other.
Right.
I've had people come to me and say like things like, wow, that wasn't just from Elliot. That was God speaking through Elliot.
What does Jesus say in the end of the Gospel of Matthew, right? That we see God in our neighbor, right? What is
Is that
what you have done to the least of these you have done to me?
Right.
When I
was hungry, you fed me.
When I was
yes. thirsty, you gave me something to drink.
Right. So that to me, that has always been such a powerful way of saying we do genuinely encounter God in others.
Where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am with you. Like
Right.
it's another way of saying like when you guys come together in my name, like I'm with you, I'm speaking with you.
Yep. And
Is God in the room?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
There's 3 of us.
Yeah.
There's 3 of us.
That's right. And I think part of Josh's question, because he asked me this question via text message, was he was asking this in response to our discussion of Genesis and the formation of Genesis and these sources that are at play. And I think this was new information to Josh, and he was genuinely curious. Okay, if this is the way this book was formed, and it wasn't just that God divinely communicated it directly to Moses, who then transcribed it, how does this work? And I think that community answer, Rick said this in that initial episode, is really at the heart of this, is that this is a communal experience. These are various communities of people and the authors that wrote them over a long period of time, bringing these things together, oral traditions, written traditions.
These stories were told around the campfire.
I mean, you
and
gotta go back
over
to that.
and over again. And then someone's like, this kind of, I can write.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I'm one of the few people around that can write. I'm going to write this down. And then somebody else wrote it down. Then somebody else wrote it down. And someone started like editing them together. And, and then people start translating it. Like it's not God speaking once and the book falls from the heavens. It's God keeps speaking.
Yeah.
And God has continued to speak. One of the things that I said when we were chatting earlier, we have these scriptures contained in the Bible, but God continues to speak to us today. And another place you can look for places where God has continued to speak in various ways to people is you can even just look back to our saints. Many of our saints, part of what they did, part of what they felt was God speaking to them. Joan of Arc having an experience of God that led her to fight for her people.
Ignatius Loyola, Saint Teresa
of
Avila,
right?
So,
there are many other people you can look to who had experiences you can hear from their lives as written down by themselves, the things that they themselves have written, and things that other people have written for us, that those carry forward as well. Yep. Okay, so our next question was a write-in question, and this is from Sharon. She asked, my question pertains to God hardening Pharaoh's heart. If God created us to have free will, why did he harden Pharaoh's heart? The Bible doesn't make it clear. I know one of the reasons was to show the Israelites and Egyptians his power and that he is the one true and powerful God.
Thank you, Sharon, for this question. I love it.
Great question.
We love it when staff members submit questions. That's
right.
Awesome. Hi, Sharon. I know she listens to it. She was listening to this podcast the other day when I was walking through the lobby.
It is kind of funny to hear our voices.
It is
coming
very
out of
funny. I know. So, there are just some things that the Bible just throws out there and offers no answer at all. Like I usually say it, the Bible it just isn't interested in answering that question. However, this, one of the phrases that comes up again and again in the early chapters of Exodus is that from the Israelites' perspective, the purpose of the Exodus was to free them from slavery and bring them to the promised land. It's kind of clear in the early chapters of Exodus, though, that from God's perspective, God's purpose was so that the Israelites and Egypt and the nations of the earth would acknowledge that Yahweh is God, that God is God. And in order to do that, there had to be some tension. And so God offers this tension by hardening Pharaoh's heart. And so every once in a while, Pharaoh's like, all right, you guys can go. I've not enough of these plagues. And then he has a change of mind. It's like, nope, you're not going anywhere. And then he does it again, and he does it again. And all of those plagues and all of those times give an opportunity for the Egyptians and the Israelites to recognize that God is God. So I think within the lines of the story, I think that is the purpose of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I do think this story makes that pretty clear that God is trying to display something about God's self through these actions. And that's repeated. And Sharon even acknowledged that. And I think Rabbi Green discussed that. I do think Rabbi Green presented, if you go back to that episode, a very intriguing position on this story, that to remember that this goes back to Josh's question about divine revelation, that these are stories of communities of people in relationship with God, and that in some sense, these are not unmediated stories, right? Like these stories are mediated through their experiences. And I think Rabbi Green presented a very intriguing perspective, which is that we have the right to kind of interrogate these stories, and even interrogate God, right? I mean, wrestle. Yeah, this goes all. I'm going to return to this wrestling theme. Yeah, that we can do that, and to ask ourselves, what does this perspective on God present to us, and what do we need to wrestle with that? And I think, knowing Sharon, that's kind of what Sharon's doing. She's wrestling with the challenge of this text, which, even as Rabbi Green admitted, kind of makes God into a bit of a petulant tyrant a bit in a face-off with Pharaoh. The one thing I will add quickly is that I was telling Natalee and Rick before the episode, there's a long tradition of Jewish midrash that has wrestled with this as well. Like this, let me be clear, this is not something that modern sensibilities are like, oh, God doesn't look too great here. People have been dealing with this for thousands of years. And there's no easy answers, let me be clear. But one of the things they have very, very perceptively picked up on is that in the first 5 of the 10 plagues, it is very ambiguous, God's relationship to Pharaoh, meaning that, yes, at the outset of the story, God says to Moses, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart, right? I believe that's in Exodus 4. But when you actually get to the 10 plagues, the first 5 of the 10, the Hebrew makes it either ambiguous or clear that Pharaoh is the one who hardens his own heart. And then in the next 5, it becomes very clear that God is the one that hardens Pharaoh's heart. And ancient Jewish and Christian interpreters looked at this and said, this is an example of the interplay between human free will and divine agency, and that this is a demonstration of what happens when we continually fail to repent, when we fail to listen to the heed or warning that's being presented to us. I don't think that really solves how uncomfortable these texts can be,
right?
But it is important to say that is a tradition of reading this story. And I will fully admit, I did not pick up on that when I'm reading the 10 plagues. Like, I'm kind of just reading them, and these readers would really pay attention, as we've learned through talking about some midrash, the smallest little details. And they felt that this was a really important small detail through the 10 plagues.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. I think when we were talking earlier, we also pointed out that it's not just the Egyptians who God's greatness needs to be proven to. It is the Israelites themselves. As we continue to see in Exodus, the Israelites continue to kind of push against what God is asking of them, and they have trust issues, which are understandable.
As soon as they get to the wilderness,
Right.
as soon as they get there, they start complaining.
Yeah.
Like it's like the next paragraph.
It's really hard.
Yeah.
When you've lived a particular way for hundreds of years, it's the only thing you've ever known, and suddenly you're thrown into something new, it's really hard to trust that it's going to be okay. I think that's some of what goes on in there. But it isn't just the Egyptians and the Israelites who are learning that the Lord is the greatest God. We see in Exodus 18, remember that Moses was married to the Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian. Mm-hmm. So the Midianites also are learning. Jethro ends up saying, "Blessed be the Lord who has delivered you from the Egyptians and from Pharaoh. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because he delivered the people from the Egyptians when they dealt arrogantly with them." So first of all, we're talking about there's other gods out there to the belief of these other peoples, and that this Lord is the greatest and the biggest of all of them.
And that journey starts from Exodus 5 when Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, Yahweh told me to take my people out into the wilderness. We're going to worship. And Pharaoh says, who is Yahweh that I should listen to him? I don't acknowledge Yahweh, and I won't send Israel off either. So we go from Pharaoh being like, who are you talking about? I don't even know this guy, to the end of the story. Like, you have this pagan priest, like,
right,
God is God. This is, like,
right.
And it's because there was this back and forth between plagues and these great acts of God, and then a splitting of the sea, and now
right.
Now we know who God is.
Yeah, and it's probably crucial to say important characters in this story are the sorcerers that Pharaoh uses, right, to kind of compete with Moses, and there would have been a belief that these sorcerers were empowered by the gods of Egypt. So there's really a contest.
So there's some things they're able to do.
Yes,
and then all of a sudden their juice runs out, and they're like, yeah, we can't do that.
Right.
Well, and you see more competitions like that as we continue to read the scriptures. You're going to see more of that.
Oh yeah, just wait till we learn about Baal, right? All these contests,
fire coming down from. Oh yeah.
The one last thing I'll say on this, and we can wrap this one up, is another to your point, Natalee, about Exodus 18 and God almost being in this contest with the other gods, is Exodus 12:12. And this is when, talk about a very hard passage in Scripture. God is, through the Passover, going to execute the firstborns in Egypt. I don't have an answer to that, I will say. Yeah. There's no answer there. But part of what he says there at the end of that verse is, on all of the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord.
Yeah.
So there's this real sense that this is not only a contest between Israel and Egypt as people, but the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt. That there's a contest happening here. And in some sense, going back to the question of metaphor, it wouldn't have been thought of as metaphorical, that it really would have been thought there were gods of Egypt and they have power. They're empowering these sorcerers. And we have our God, and our God is battling these gods and defeating them through this contest of will.
It is exactly how ancient civilizations saw themselves.
Yeah.
We're very exclusionistic, like my religion's right and your religion is probably wrong.
Yep.
Right? But in the ancient world, I have my religion, my God, and you have your gods.
Yeah.
And
they really exist.
Yep.
And when my people goes to war against your people, it's my gods going to war against your gods.
Right.
And when my gods win, then I'm going to carve up some stone and say how my God, won this great victory for me, because they saw it as not just something that was going on here on earth, but it's like literally a
cosmic battle.
Yeah.
You see this also reflected in the Ten Commandments, because what's the first thing that God says? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me.
Mm-hmm.
Why does God need to say that?
Before me.
Right. In this, as we're establishing this nation of peoples around this God, our God, this is a moment of staking that claim.
Yeah. I want to say one last thing about Exodus as a whole with Sharon's question, because I feel like I could do a whole episode on this question, because it just I feel Sharon's unsettlement, this section unsettles me as well. And I think one of the important things to realize about Exodus, Rick, you made a point earlier about talking about the Bible says, and how really we have to be very careful doing that, because this isn't one work. This is a collection of works, right? And these books have different perspectives on God, different themes, different kind of cores. And I would contend that at the core of Exodus are kind of two categories: glory and holiness. And we see this throughout, right? Especially when we get to Mount Sinai and following. The God that is presented in Exodus is very concerned with his glory and the ensuing holiness that is required of the people, the construction of the tabernacle. That, he talks about Israel being a holy nation, these offerings that need to be offered, that if you walk into his presence, you might die. And I think that's really important for understanding what's happening at the beginning of Exodus with these demonstrations. That's not an easy answer, but maybe another answer is that it's important to remember our scriptures contend with one another even, and that we do have presentations of God that I don't want to use the word contradict, but I'll just say contend with what's presented here. That, when we get into the prophets, there is a contention that God is less concerned with purity and holiness like he is here, and more concerned with justice, right? You think of Amos, you think of Isaiah, that I'm not concerned. What is the famous in Amos 5, right? That I'm not concerned with your rituals and how strikingly different is that than what we find in Exodus, right? Now there's ways to...
And then you have the very pastoral, like, the Lord is my shepherd, and he goes out and finds the one sheep that is lost and puts it on his shoulders. Very different than if you enter my presence and you enter unworthily, you will be struck down. It's yeah. So, and again, that's not to say that these things. Again, wrestling. We wrestle with these images of God and we integrate them. We don't try to. Our goal is not to just say, "Oh, this one's. Let's exclude it. We don't like it." Stick a pin in God's holiness, though, because when we get to Leviticus, it is all about holiness.
Yep. Yeah. So anyway, we could go on forever, but maybe we should stop there.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to bring up one last thing, is that I believe Rabbi Green was the one who said in our most recent episode, in some of these scriptural texts, particularly here in Exodus, you get some of the best of God and some of the worst of God.
Yeah. I feel that.
I will name that we did get a few other questions, and they were related specifically to the readings from the Gospel of Matthew. Now, I know we said early on, we're tackling the Bible from cover to cover, even though our reading plan does include those gospel readings. Full disclosure, this is a new podcast. We haven't done this before, and we're figuring some things out as we go along. As you can tell, we've had to do a bonus episode to answer your questions. Our plan is to do a bonus episode coming up in the next couple of weeks, just to do a first run at the Gospel of Matthew. Now, since in our reading plan, we will get through each of the four Gospels four times, I believe, we're going to come back around. We're not going to catch everything the first time we go through Matthew. We'll be back around to it again after we've gone through Mark, Luke, John. So stay tuned for that. And we have a pin in your questions, Allie and Susan. We have not forgotten you. We will get to you, I promise.
Good stuff. It's probably worth reminding folks, Rick, because you created this Bible plan, that the intent was to discuss and work really heavily through the 3 chapters a day, cover to cover, right? And that this one chapter, it's not that we don't care about it, but it's kind of anchoring you. It's a refuge when going.
It's like home base.
It's home base.
Right. It's Jesus. It's stories. It's
right. Yeah. So we're not going to be dealing with that really on these weekly cover to cover release episodes, right?
Right.
I think that I've had a few in-person questions of like, oh, when are you going to talk about that? And so Natalee has developed this wonderful plan of having an episode each time we finish a full gospel. So January 28th, we'll have read the 28th chapter of Matthew, and shortly after there will be a full episode on Matthew dropping. We will not get to all 28 chapters of Matthew. There is a lot of stuff happening in Matthew. But since we're going through it 4 times, there's a sense in which we'll do this every time we've finished. And so hopefully we will get to as much content as we can. And anything we can't, drop a few questions.
Yep.
Yeah, we'll come back around to you. All right. Well, thank you all for listening in. Let's keep sending those questions along. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley,
Elliot VanHoy,
and Natalee Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalee Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and MoodMode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org.